Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are taking a massive swing at really the question that defines global inequality. Why are some nations rich while others seem stuck in poverty and corruption?
Yeah, it's a huge one.
And we're using a landmark book as our guide, Why Nations Fail by Darren Acemoglu and James A. Robinson.
A really foundational text in development economics and political science.
Absolutely. So if you've ever felt, overwhelmed trying to grasp the roots of global poverty, or maybe you suspected those old answers like bad geography or lazy culture just didn't cut it.
Which they often don't.
Right. Then this deep dive is for you. Our goal today is basically to shortcut you to understanding their really bold, history-packed theory. They argue prosperity is not about geography or culture. It's about something humans design.
Exactly. And that shift in focus is key. It moves away from things nations can't easily change, like their location, to things they can, which is how they're structured. Their core idea is that the destiny of nations boils down to their political and economic institutions. Specifically, are those institutions inclusive or are they extractive? That's the lens they use to look back over, 500 years of global history? It's quite the scope.
It really is. So let's unpack that institutional divide right now because, honestly, it feels like the engine driving their whole argument. We need to get clear on these two types, inclusive versus extractive. And why does that difference matter so much for, people's actual lives? What makes a system inclusive?
Right. So inclusive institutions, they're fundamentally about distributing power broadly and creating incentives for, pretty much everyone.
Right.
Think rule of law that applies equally to everybody. Secure property rights, knowing your stuff won't just be taken in competitive, open markets, places where new businesses can actually pop up and challenge the old guard. And critically, political accountability, real checks and balances, genuine pluralism.
So the outcomes are sort of baked in.
Pretty much. Because people trust the system, more or less they know their property is safe, their contracts will be enforced. They get to keep the rewards of their hard work or clever ideas they're willing to invest.
Makes sense.
They invest in education, in new technologies, in long-term projects. And that's what fuels sustained growth. Not just a short burst, but ongoing broad-based prosperity driven by innovation.
Okay, so that's the ideal. What about the flip side? What does it actually feel like day to day living under an extractive system?
Yeah, the opposite is, it's grim. Extractive institutions are designed, often very consciously, to funnel wealth and power upwards into the hands of a small group, an elite.
How do it do that?
Through things like state-granted monopolies, rampant corruption, laws that are enforced arbitrarily depending on who you know, and crucially, a complete lack of political accountability. The whole setup is rigged to let the few extract resources, wealth, labor, you name it, from the majority.
And the impact on people's motivation.
It just crushes it. I mean, why bother starting a business or inventing something new or working super hard if you know that as soon as you get a little successful?
Someone powerful will take it.
Exactly. The local party boss, the connected family, whoever, they'll demand a huge bribe or change the rules or just outright seize your assets. So people don't bother. These systems kill creativity, they discourage effort, they guarantee inequality, stagnation, and often, a lot of instability.
They use some really striking examples to make this concrete. I mean, the North and South Korea comparison is almost like a perfect natural experiment, isn't it?
It really is. You've got the same people, same culture, same language, same peninsula, split by an arbitrary line after World War II.
In 1945, yeah.
And right away, North Korea goes full extractive. Dictatorship, central planning, no private property, total elite control. South Korea, meanwhile. Well, it had its own rough patches and dictators early on, for sure.
Definitely not a straight line.
No, but it trended, however haltingly, towards more inclusive elements, more market mechanisms, eventually stronger checks on power, more democracy. And the results, you see this stark divergence. One is a desperately poor, isolated state. The other becomes a global economic giant. It's institutions, clearly, not the geography, not the people themselves.
Which leads us right into how the authors just dismantle those old convenient myths about why some countries are poor. They really push back hard against the idea that geography is destiny, or worse, that it's about culture, like some populations just don't have a work ethic.
Yeah, they reject that completely. Their argument is blunt. Poor nations aren't poor because of some inherent flaw or bad luck with climate. They're poor because their political and economic systems are essentially predatory. They're designed to keep them poor by the elites in charge.
And that Nogales example, wow, That's maybe the most visually powerful piece of evidence they present.
Well, absolutely.
You have this one city literally sliced in half by the U.S.-Mexico border, Nogales, Arizona on one side, Nogales, Sonora on the other.
Same place, same people crossing back and forth, same history until the border became rigid, same desert climate. They're right next to each other.
But the lives people live.
Worlds apart. On the U.S. side, much higher average income, better health care, reliable schools, basic safety, functioning courts.
Yeah.
Why? Because the institutions north of that line guarantee certain rights.
Yeah.
Secure property, relatively low corruption, a way to hold officials somewhat accountable.
And just south of the line.
Lower wages, businesses struggling with corruption and red tape, more crime, political instability. It's just a constant background noise. It's a living, breathing illustration of institutional divergence. It just blows that geography argument out of the water, doesn't it?
Completely. Same climate, different rules, different outcomes.
And they apply this logic everywhere. Look, tropical nations can thrive. Think Singapore or parts of Australia. If they build inclusive institutions. And resource-rich nations, they can fail spectacularly.
Right.
Venezuela is a tragic modern example. If they fall prey to extractive regimes, those resources, oil, diamonds, whatever, often become a curse. They just fuel the elite's power and corruption rather than benefiting the population.
Okay, but that raises a really important question. If these extractive systems are so bad for most people, and the failures are often so obvious, like looking across the border in Nogales, why do they persist? Why don't people just, rise up and change things? It feels like nations get stuck.
They absolutely do get stuck, and that's where the historical perspective becomes so crucial. Nations don't just randomly pick inclusive or extractive out of a hat. History pushes them. And this brings us to their concept of critical junctures.
Okay, critical junctures sounds like major turning points in history. Forks in the road.
That's exactly it. Think of big disruptive events. The Black Death in Europe, the age of colonialism, maybe a revolution, a major war. Moments where the old way of doing things, the existing political and economic setup, gets shaken up. These junctures create an opening. A moment of uncertainty where things could go different ways. A nation might pivot towards more inclusion, more checks on power, broader participation. Or it might double down on extraction, on concentrating power even more tightly.
And the example they focus on for the rise of inclusive systems, the big one, is the Glorious Revolution in England, 1688.
Yes. And it's crucial to see it wasn't just swapping one king for another. It was an institutional revolution.
How so?
Well, before 1688, the English monarch had huge power. They could raise taxes when they wanted, seize property, basically ignore Parliament if they felt like it. The Glorious Revolution changed the rules of the game. It permanently limited the king's power and made Parliament supreme.
And the key change was?
Parliament got control of the purse strings, taxation and government spending. That might sound dry, but it was revolutionary. It meant the state couldn't just arbitrarily take people's money or property anymore.
Ah, so that created security.
Precisely. Secure property rights. Suddenly, investing for the long term felt much safer. If you built a factory or developed a new farming technique, you could be reasonably sure you reap the rewards. And that security, that predictability, laid the groundwork for entrepreneurship, innovation, and eventually, the Industrial Revolution. It unleashed potential.
Okay, so England takes this turn towards inclusivity. Contrast that with, say, Spain or Russia around similar times. They face crises, too.
They did. But their elites made different choices. In Spain, in Russia, the response to challenges was often to centralize power even more, to reinforce the autocratic rule, preserve the privileges of the nobility and the crown. They chose to keep the extractive structures firmly in place.
And that leads to what they call path dependency.
Exactly. Once you start down one path, especially the extractive one, it gets harder and harder to change course. Think of it like laying down railway track. The longer the track runs in one direction, the more investment goes into maintaining that line, the more the whole system adapts to it. Shifting those tracks to a completely different destination becomes incredibly difficult and costly.
Because the people in charge benefit from the existing track?
Precisely. The elites who control the extractive system, they control the army, the courts. Maybe the media use that power to block any reforms that might threaten their wealth or control.
Yeah.
Even if those reforms would benefit the country as a whole in the long run. It's not accidental. It's an active defense of the extractive path.
And you really can't discuss path dependency without talking about the massive impact of the colonial legacy, can you? That seems like it set the tracks for so many nations.
Absolutely, devastatingly so. The authors are very clear. European colonizers didn't set up colonies to foster local development or democracy. They set up systems designed purely for extraction.
Right. To get resources out.
Get resources out, exploit cheap labor, transfer wealth back to the home country. They often deliberately suppressed local education, imposed forced labor or cash crop systems that destroyed local food security, and denied things like private property rights or the rule of law to the local population because that would empower them.
And the really tragic part.
The tragic part is that when these colonies finally gained independence, the new local elites often found it easiest and most profitable for themselves to just take over the existing extractive machinery. The same oppressive laws, the same state control over resources, the same lack of accountability. The colonial tools of control were just inherited.
Wow, that's the definition of a vicious cycle starting point. But they do offer some hope, right? They point to Botswana as an example of breaking that cycle.
Yes, and Botswana is a crucial counterexample. After independence, despite being resource-rich with diamonds, which often fuels extraction, the resource curse, Botswana's leaders made different choices.
What did they do?
They deliberately built inclusive political institutions first. They ensured checks on power, maintained traditional consultation practices alongside modern democracy, secured property rights, and managed the diamond revenue relatively responsibly for national development. It shows that history, even a colonial legacy, isn't an inescapable fate. Change is possible, though it's clearly very difficult.
Okay, this is where it gets super interesting for me. How these institutions, once they're in place, actually reinforce themselves. You mentioned the virtuous cycle and the vicious cycle. Can you break down how they work? How does the good cycle keep going, and how does the bad one dig itself deeper?
Right, so the virtuous cycle happens on the inclusive path. Secure rights, encourage innovation and investment, as we said. That broad-based economic activity creates demand for more education. A more educated population tends to demand more political participation, more say in how things are run. This leads to greater pluralism, stronger checks on power, more accountability, which then further secures rights and encourages more innovation. See the loop.
Yeah, it feeds itself. Each positive element strengthens the others. It makes it harder for any one group to just grab power.
Exactly. Power is dispersed. Checks and balances are real, embedded throughout society. It's resilient.
Okay, so the vicious cycle must be the depressing opposite.
It is. Under extractive institutions, the elites use their concentrated political power to rig the economy in their favor. They block reforms, they might suppress technology that threatens their monopolies, they crush dissent. They often deliberately underinvest in education for the masses because an educated population might challenge them. They drain the country's wealth for their own benefit. This increases inequality, which fuels resentment, but the elites use their control of the state, the police, the army to maintain order and prevent change. Power consolidates more power. Wealth extracts more wealth. There's often no peaceful way out for ordinary people.
But hold on a second. History seems to show that some extractive economies can grow, at least for a while, sometimes quite rapidly, right?
Yeah.
Think about the Soviet Union's industrialization, or even aspects of China's growth at certain points.
That's a really important point, and the authors address it directly. Yes, extractive states can generate growth, especially in the short to medium term. They can do it by forcibly mobilizing resources, moving labor from farms to factories, pouring state capital into heavy industry.
Like the Soviet five-year plans.
Exactly. Central planning and coercion can achieve impressive feats of resource allocation and infrastructure building.
So why isn't that sustainable, according to them? What's missing?
What's missing is innovation and adaptability. Long-term prosperity in the modern world depends on constant technological change, on what Schumpeter called creative destruction, new ideas and businesses replacing old ones.
Okay.
In an extractive system, there's very little incentive for that kind of dynamic innovation from the ground up. If you invent something truly disruptive, the elites might see it as a threat to their control or their existing businesses. They might steal it, regulate it out of existence, or demand crippling bribes.
So people just don't bother taking the risk.
Largely, yes. Why risk everything for an idea that will likely be taken from you? Extractive systems are good at commanding existing resources, but terrible at fostering the decentralized creativity and adaptation needed for ongoing cutting-edge growth. Eventually, they tend to hit a wall.
Okay, that clarifies a lot. So if the real engine of prosperity is these internal institutions, what does this framework tell us about global development efforts today? All the foreign aid, the investment, how does that fit in? It seems like they're tackling the global development dilemma.
Yeah, the dilemma is basically this. Well-intentioned efforts from the outside, like foreign aid or big World Bank loans, often fail. And they fail according to Acemoglu and Robinson, because they ignore the fundamental institutional reality on the ground.
How so?
If you pour billions of dollars into a country run by an extractive elite,
Hmm.
where does that money actually go?
Right into the elite's pockets or projects that benefit them.
Often, yes. It can reinforce their power, help them buy weapons to suppress dissent, fuel corruption. It rarely trickles down effectively to the poor,
Yeah.
or helps build the foundations for inclusive growth. You might inadvertently be propping up the very system that causes the poverty. You're treating the symptom, not the disease, and maybe even making the disease worse.
Wow. Okay, so this really shifts the perspective on development aid. This brings us then to the big takeaways, the critical lessons that you, listening right now, should probably carry forward when you think about global affairs or read the news. What are they?
I think there are three core ones. First, democracy matters. And not just elections, but real political inclusivity, checks on power, accountability. These aren't some optional luxury for rich countries. The authors argue they are essential foundations for creating the economic institutions that lead to sustainable prosperity.
Okay, democracy first. What's second?
Second, politics precedes economics. You can't just wish for secure property rights or open competitive markets if you have an authoritarian regime calling the shots arbitrarily. The political framework has to be right or stable enough to guarantee the economic rules of the game. Otherwise, investment won't happen, innovation gets stifled.
Got it. Political structure enables the economic structure. And the third lesson.
Third, and this is maybe the toughest one, reform requires struggle. Extractive elites benefit massively from the status quo. They have wealth, they control the state. They are not going to give up that power and privilege voluntarily just because it would be good for the country.
Right.
So, meaningful change toward inclusive institutions almost always requires pressure from below. It demands political mobilization, civic resistance, brave leadership willing to challenge entrenched interests. It's often a long and difficult fight.
So putting it all together for external actors like aid organizations or other governments.
The implication is that external support should focus less on just pouring in cash and more on finding ways to help strengthen local inclusive institutions, empowering citizens, supporting independent media, perhaps helping build a more impartial judiciary, fostering that internal demand for change rather than just funding the elites.
It's a powerful framework. Acemoglu and Robinson delivered this really clear, sweeping message across centuries. Prosperity isn't luck, it's not geography, it's fundamentally a political choice.
Yeah.
Nations succeed when they manage, through struggle and sometimes luck at critical junctures, to build inclusive systems where everyone, not just a handful at the top, has a chance to participate, to innovate, and to benefit from the economy.
And because institutions evolve, because change can happen, as Botswana showed, even deeply entrenched systems aren't necessarily permanent. Those critical junctures can still arise. Collective action can still make a difference.
Which brings us to a final thought for you to ponder.
If today's vast global inequality is largely the result of centuries of this institutional divergence, then maybe the question to ask yourself is, what specific institutions, maybe even in your own country, are currently acting as roadblocks? Which ones are resisting crucial inclusive reforms right now? And what kind of collective effort might be needed to nudge them or even fundamentally shift them onto a more inclusive path, breaking whatever vicious cycles might still be operating?